Welcome to the lecture 21 of our course, and this is the first lecture of week 5. So, in week 4 we were talking about morphology, and the first lecture of week 5 will end the discussion of morphology. So, the topic of today's lecture is morphological typology, and from today's lecture we will also start talking about syntax, which is the core topic for this week. So, we will be having a quick recap of what all did we learn in morphology in today's class, and we will be also talking about the arrangement of morphemes in different languages. That is the primary goal of today's class, how the morphemes are arranged in different languages. With this question, I will introduce you to the idea of morphological typology and also discuss different types. Please keep in mind that we will be having a detailed series on typology later, but today it is just the beginning of your introduction to the concept of typology. So, if I ask you to think about what all did you learn in morphology, this is a quick recap. We talked about the notion of morpheme, and we found that there are both semantic and grammatical components while talking about the notion of morpheme. We did talk about the differences between morpheme, morph and allomorph. We did talk about different types of morpheme. If you remember, we talked about free and bound morphemes, lexical and functional morphemes, for example. We also tried to understand the differences between root, stem and base, and we discussed the differences between inflectional and derivational morphemes. We also talked about a few more processes of word formation like conversion, back formation, clipping, blending, etc. And we talked about the idea of reduplication in terms of child language acquisition. We then talked about the notion of productivity, blocking, and we started talking about the relationship between morphology and syntax. Then we finally discuss the idea of compounds and headedness. So, I am asking a very different question now, and I am sure many of you have similar questions in your mind. How are the morphemes arranged in different languages? So, is it the case that the arrangement of morphemes are same in all languages of the world, or there are differences in relation to the arrangement? So, hope you remember the idea of language universals, which is different from universal grammar. You remember that I introduced this idea of language universals to you previously. We can say that many of the universals are abstract properties of universal grammars that particular languages may have. The study of language universals are the difference between languages. So, here let me introduce the name of Greenberg, who started talking about universals, and you will know more about Greenberg's work later while doing typology. But what did Greenberg say? He said that structural patterns of languages are not random. There are patterns that recur in different languages, and the study of the range of patterns with which the languages may vary is basically the domain of language typology. We basically talk about different types in language. So, types can be different in terms of phonology, morphology, syntax, etc. So, today we will be talking about morphological typology only. So, there are similarities and differences both between languages in which they form words. So, we are focusing on word formation only, and on the basis of word formation we have broad 5 morphological types, and this is our goal, to learn about these 5 morphological types in today's class. These are the name of the 5 types that I am introducing to you. The first one is analytic or isolating languages, second is agglutinating or agglutinative languages, the third is inflecting, synthetic or fusional languages, fourth is polysynthetic or incorporational languages, and the fifth one is templatic languages. So, we consider the word morpheme ratio while considering the morphological types. This is something that we have to remember. Now, I have some data from different languages in order to discuss these 5 different types. So, here is some data from Mandarin Chinese. So, you can see that we can have actually morpheme by morpheme translation here if you look at the gloss. And what do I mean by gloss? Look how I have mentioned the grammatical forms on the second line, and in the third line we are talking about the total translation of the sentence. So, you will also get more examples. This is how we write examples in linguistics, we call it glossing, and there are certain rules for it as well. So, we can have morpheme by morpheme translation here, and we can see that the words are bare unaffixed. You will not find affixes, right, these are like small components, and each morpheme may occur as a word in isolation. This is very important. Words will not have inflectional affixes, though they bear aspectual markings. So, you see my lay is basically, lay is the aspect marker here. So, these are basically isolating example of isolating languages. So, now let us come to Turkish. Let us look at the data. El the hand, elim my hand, eller the hands, elim de in my hand, ellerim my hands, and ellerim de is in my hand. So, how are the morphemes organized here? Is it similar with the previous data? You can easily figure out that it is not the case. In the previous data from Mandarin Chinese, you can figure out that there are small morphemes which are occurring in isolation, and you can have a one-to-one mapping. So, here it is very different. If you have already done the analysis of the data, you figured out the following generalizations. So, el is hand, im is my, ler is plural, and de is in. So, you can easily figure out how to find the morphemes from data given. You can do it from any language if you have translations. So, we can say that in Turkish, the nature of the morphemes are very different from Mandarin Chinese. Turkish is an example of agglutinative language. What do we mean by agglutinative language? There are more or less one-to-one matching of morphemes with morphs. So, we have the morphs which are glued together. Now, we have some data from Latin, where you can see that there is the paradigm here is basically predicting certain patterns. If you know Sanskrit, then you are familiar with this pattern. Sanskrit has similar pattern. So, based on nominative, genitive and ablative cases, for both singular and plural, you have the following pattern which is basically indicating certain ideas. Latin is known as an inflectional language, and words here have several morphemes, but rarely a one-to-one mapping between morphemes and morphs. So, a single morph can represent several morphemes. You can say that one morph is basically indicating a number of different functions. So, this is common in Sanskrit as well. This is a feature of inflectional languages. Now, you have some data from Greenlandic, and it's slightly different from the previous data. You can see that this is different from Turkish, because it's different that you have different components are coming together in one word. So, he saw a caribou, it is basically one word, but it is indicating one entire sentence. So, it is an example of polysynthetic language. So, you can basically use one word to incorporate what needs to be said in a sentence. This is of course different from Turkish. This is an example of incorporating languages. And in Arabic, you have a root, something like 3 consonants K, T, B, which is also known as trilateral root. So, the root provides a skeleton, and you can insert different vowels in the skeleton in order to create different word forms. The structure is very different. So, the example that I have mentioned here are kitab, katab and katib, book, he wrote and writer. So, you have the same root k, t and b, you are inserting different vowels here in the skeleton in order to create different word forms. This is basically templatic type. So, you can think about the different types now, and if you think about all the 5 types, you will see that as I told you earlier, there is a difference in terms of ratio, right, the ratio between word and morpheme. So, this is the indicator for different types. So, let us consider the ratio here. So, if a language has 1 to 1.99 morphemes per word, we can say it is an analytic or isolating language. Example is Chinese. If you remember the Chinese data, we had very small morphemes which are occurring in isolation, right. Languages with average 2 to 2.99 morphemes per word are known as synthetic or inflecting languages like Latin. So, we also talked about the fact that one morph can indicate several functions, if you remember. The third one is basically agglutinative languages, where languages can have average 2 to 2.99 morphemes per word. Example is Turkish. And the fourth one is polysynthetic or incorporating. So, you can say that a language is polysynthetic if the language has average 3 morphemes or more. So, if you remember Greenlandic, the data, so you have basically one word where multiple morphs are put together, and it is basically an incorporating language. So, we will be moving to syntax next, and we are wrapping up morphology in today's class. Before that, I will ask you to think about a number of questions. So, we did learn about certain concepts which will be super useful for us while doing syntax from the next class onwards. The first point that I would like to mention is the difference between words and phrases. So, if you remember the difference between words and phrases, we did ask this question in terms of open-endedness, whether both are open-ended or not, and whether we can have a particular number of words instead of particular number of sentences, etc. So, this is a difference between words and phrases. We also ask this question while discussing compounds, right. So, can we say that compounds are basically words, or these are very close to phrases? These are the questions that we ask. In different ways, we can say that where is the boundary between morphology and syntax. So, we did talk about headedness, and I told you that the notion of headedness will be useful in syntax as well. So, how do we determine heads? If you remember, so we talked about the concept of constituent, which is something like NP or VP, and then there is a very prominent person inside a constituent who is sitting there and controlling the entire part. We do call them the heads. So, how do we determine the heads is another question which will be useful for us for syntax, the idea that we learned from morphology, and we learned the idea of headedness in terms of compounds, if you remember. So, we did say that there is right handed, there is a rule of right handedness which is important for us to decide the nature of compounds, the type of compounds. We also asked the questions related to the role of a lexicon. We went back to this idea of mental lexicon. If you remember, we started the lectures on morphology from mental lexicon. We started asking this question, what is a mental lexicon, how do we put different components together inside our head, whether there is something called words in the mind or not. So, what is the role of lexicon is also a question which will help us to understand certain ideas in syntax. So, I will ask you to remember this. how lexicon is basically putting a lot of things together in form of a repository inside our head, and we shall be asking the knowledge of language questions again. What do I mean by the knowledge of language questions? We basically talk about the creation of sentences. So, how do we create infinite sentences? So, this is the question that we started asking in the beginning part of the course. In the first and second week, we did talk about certain questions related to knowledge of language. If you remember Plato's problem, poverty of stimulus, etc. So, we will be basically coming to those theoretical questions again, and while we will start syntax, initially we will be talking about certain theoretical ideas that we have discussed beforehand, and this will be helping us to go into the more detail. So, we are coming to the conclusion part of today's class. So, today basically we talked about the arrangements of the morphemes in different languages. We did this in terms of morphological typology, and in order to talk about morphological typology, we talked about the word and morpheme ratio. We did find that there are 5 major types of languages according to morphological typology or the word morpheme ratio. There is isolating language, agglutinating language, inflectional language, incorporating language, and templatic languages. We also discussed the data from all these languages and talked about certain features. So, it is very important for you to figure out the language, the morphological typology of the language that you speak. If you speak a language which is inflectional, or if you speak a language which is agglutinating, or if you speak a language which is isolating, all these are quite common in India. So, we will be talking about these in future classes, but it will be really great if you can figure out the morphological typology of your own language or the languages that you speak. So, we will wrap up the discussion of morphology here. From the next class, we will start talking about syntax. This is the key reference for the class. Thank you.